Hey, everybody, how's it going? Andrew here. And I just want to ask for a small favor, which is if you're a fan of the show, then share it with someone you know. Seriously, if you like the content, the topics, the guests that we have here on the show, and feel that what we're discussing is really helpful and beneficial for you, great. But then all that we ask for is if you think that could also help someone else, then just share it with them in whatever capacity, whether it's a community, online, it doesn't matter. If you just feel that this is helpful for you and others can benefit from the content, then it would just mean the world to us if you could share it with them too. So that's it. Again, can't thank you so much for being such great listeners. And now let's get right to the show. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, and I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about creating impactful production and collaboration. Now, having a clearly defined production and collaboration process can make all the difference in how a project progresses. However, it's not always easy to achieve, and sometimes can feel like a mystery that takes forever to solve. So today, we're going to delve into various obstacles related to this and uncover strategies for overcoming them, discussing everything from effective team building to communication. And through that, we'll discover how teams can navigate the process effectively and foster creativity that has a positive impact for the project and everyone involved. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Eva Stiller. Eva, how is it going? And thank you so much for being here today.
It's going great, thank you. And I'm very glad to be here as well.
Awesome. Well, definitely appreciate that because there's a lot of cool, interesting things that we're going to be talking about today. But first and foremost, folks, if you're not familiar with Eva, she is the senior producer at Mechanistry. She's also has a pretty cool history in the business, working at places like 11-Bit Studios as a senior producer there, Testronic as a QA project manager, and GOG as a production QA lead. So tons of experience in this space. And one of the games, and I'd love for you to share a little bit more with us too about this, Eva, is that Mechanistry has developed is Timberborn. So if you don't mind, share us a quick little bit about Timberborn.
So, okay, Timberborn is a post-apocalyptic city builder, but we like to call it woodpunk.
Woodpunk, okay.
It's basically a city builder where humanity has died out and beavers have taken over as the dominant species, let's say. And they're trying to make Earth a better place, basically, and deal with many different perils that come their way, which I don't want to talk about because it's a surprise. It's a fantastic game. I highly recommend it. We passed 1 million copies sold a while ago. We're very proud of it. It's in early access right now, and just check it out if it's something that might spark your interest.
Yeah, well, for anybody who likes city builders, this is, I would say, a really very interesting one because of that whole take and the setting, the characters, lots of fun and different things that you typically wouldn't see in a city builder. So awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And Eva, when you're not getting into the weeds with production and other related tasks at work, what are some things that you like to do in your spare time just to relax and plug? Anything that you'd like to share with us in terms of so you could just, do something different than games, even though they're fun?
I'm actually avid, let's say, miniature painter. I'm very much into Warhammer.
Yeah.
I also 3D print. I have a 3D printer and I paint display level minis. I'm actually planning to try my I'm gonna start. Well, start isn't the right word, but I'm just gonna take part in a painting competition in Poland here. So
Sweet.
in upcoming months. So let's see how it goes.
That's awesome. So it's yeah, I mean, from all that, and now you're even leveling up in different ways to do more. So well, I'm just really excited for you, and appreciate you sharing that with us too. Uh, so, but one thing I want to say too, I want to get to know you a little bit more than just that. And how we do that, folks, here, as some of you are familiar, is with the Q Box round. And for those of you who aren't, it's just a series of quick random questions I prepared here today for Eva. So, Eva, are you ready for the Q Box round?
Let's do it.
Awesome. That's the attitude I like. Okay, so what's one habit you have that has contributed to your success?
Wow, that's a tough question. Well, I think what really has helped me over the years is that when I come into a team, a project, a company, you name it, I usually take my initial weeks to get to know people. I basically walk around the company or call people if the company is remote only, because it's the sign of the times. And basically talk to everybody that is willing to talk to me, learn a little bit about them, learn a little bit about how they work, maybe see a little bit of their work. If they're willing to share it, what are the hurdles that they're facing? It gives me a lot of perspective on how a company project team works. I also try to build relationships with people, and I don't mean it to sound in a kind of sinister collect Pokemon kind of way, but I basically just try to get to know people, ask them about their hobbies, ask them about their, I don't know, whatever is that they like doing, and just remember them in some, have a map of the team in my head, because that's very helpful, especially in a job like mine where 50% of my job is basically talking to people. So it's very helpful if people know you or recognize you in some way, because they're always more willing to talk to you.
I absolutely love that you shared this, because I think it's something that we don't necessarily think of, and the importance of that. But also, I mean, just a quick little call out here. Um, what you just described in your process isn't that much different than Satoru Iwata, in terms of, what he did. So I'd say, it's really cool to see that in other people doing the same things, because relationships matter regardless if they're in work or outside of work, and they can really help influence how things are done, how production evolves, and everything like that. So great testament there.
Yeah,
So cool.
absolutely.
All right, next one. What's your main approach to tackling problems?
I usually ask the person or people, if there's more than one person facing the problem, to describe it to me, and also truly understanding it, because what I find very often in my job is that our perception of the problem is not always actually the problem, or sometimes it's a simple symptom of a completely different issue that we're facing. And when people tell me about it, it kind of lets me build an image of the problem in my head and then tackle it better. So again, understanding people.
I get just so the reason why I'm getting kind of jumbled up here in my response is because this what you just outlined is actually no different than any problems that we could potentially face. The more you understand the issue, the problem, and what's being perceived as, the better you can address it. And from my own experience, what I'm doing, and I'm seeing this right now with some work I'm involved with, where when you're trying to understand the problems that, let's say, players have with particular things in games, and if you can understand those things ahead of time, not necessarily, let's say, done with your game in feedback, but other games that have been released and they talk about it, then you have clear insight in terms of how to address those problems. But if you don't ask the questions or look for that information, it can make things really challenging. So I love that advice in terms of how to tackle problems or how you attack problems and ways to approach it, because it makes all the much of a difference once you have that understanding. So, all right, last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
So I'm currently playing Dragon's Dogma 2, which I'm loving and hating at the same time. There's a lot of great things in this game and a lot of things that are not sparking joy, let's say. But I can't put it down. So I think it's a testament to the fact that it's still a great game despite its problems, and I'm really enjoying it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, sometimes, games can't put us in that situation, but I guess that the ultimate indicator there is, like you said, I still can't put it down despite these other things, but and enjoying it. And yeah, love that you're making the time to play some games too, in addition to all that other fun stuff you're doing with the painting and miniatures and all that stuff. So, well, hey, thanks for letting us to get to know you a little bit more. But now let's get into the meat of this discussion, which is creating impactful production and collaboration. So, to kick off this discussion, I was curious if you could kind of provide, let's say, an overview of the indie game development process, particularly focusing on, the production side of things, and maybe shed some light on, I would say, some of the challenges and nuances that developers face, in this area, in the indie realm, if you will.
Right. So I think when you truly break it down, indie development is just a smaller team with more limited resources. Like every team has limited resources, but an indie team has even more limited resources. So a lot of indie teams probably don't have producers, which is a shame. And not to toot my own horn, but producers are pretty great. So a lot of the challenge initially probably comes from that there's a small team that highly specialize, and on top of their regular duties, they also have production duties, which can be a handful and are a handful. And also, from my own experience, what I can say is that even if you have a set of duties in a smaller company or a smaller team, then you're always going to wear many hats. Like in my previous jobs, bigger teams, bigger companies, I was very, very, very specialized. I had my own kind of box, and I never really left that box because there was just too much stuff in that box to do to actually go anywhere else. But now that I'm part of a smaller team, I'm doing things that I never anticipated I'll be doing as a producer, and sometimes that aren't even producer duties. Which is fun and quite eye-opening, and it also, teaches me a lot and lets me grow. But it's also very stressful. So I think another nuance or difficulty, I would say, is that there's a lot of change. There's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to indie game development, and that comes with a fair amount of stress that somehow you need to learn how to deal with. Otherwise, it's going to eat you. And there are things that you'll never be able to forecast. Like there are always going to be unplanned things that happen, and you kind of have to learn to live with this approach that the only sure thing is change. And again, I know it's very much similar with larger companies, larger teams, larger games. But in indie, I feel that it's just way more chaotic in a good way and way more chaotic in a bad way.
No, I'd say there's some good insights there. And I think and part of what what we can get from that too is, kind of having that understanding of acceptance of, hey, there are things that I can control, and then there's things that I can't. And if you can better get a handle and differentiate what those are and what buckets they are, then not to say that it will things can still be, overwhelming at times and everything else, but it can give you probably a better ability to grasp certain things, especially if you don't have control over it, then it's like, well, maybe I need to be mindful of this particular nuance and how to adjust or pivot. But I'm not going to spend a lot of mental energy or stress worrying about these things when that energy could be focused elsewhere, again, on the areas you do have control and stuff. And
yeah, exactly. And I think I need to add this, even though smaller companies don't have that much paperwork, indie companies still need to do production paperwork. So we still have schedules, scopes, production boards, and all the other stuff. Sometimes it's more difficult to convince the team to do those things, because if a team is smaller, then it's easier to self-organize. And like, I had situations way back in my project manager days when I was talking to a 2-person indie development team, and I asked them about their design doc, and they were like, oh, we don't have a design doc, we just talk to each other, and the game is our design doc, and that's fine. And I'm like, yeah, but what if one of you gets sick or quits, or I don't know, something bad happens? What then? We need documentation, we need things. So I think that's another challenge sometimes. Like, when you're dealing with a smaller team, telling them, look, we really need to have weekly meetings, because I know everybody hates meetings, but it's very important that we stay on track. It's very important we talk to each other. It can be a challenge to kind of get into a habit of doing it, let's say.
yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, if you think about it, I mean, it all boils down to communication, and that documentation is a form of communication. But it also does a lot more than that. It serves as a reference. It makes it so people can be on the same page, instead of like, as you're working on a team, oh, this is my idea of doing things, I'm going to do it this way. And then next thing you know, you work with your other team member or a few others. And then you're like, wait a minute, that's not what I was thinking. Well, what were you thinking? This is what I was, and then you start having this disconnect, friction.
Yeah.
Now deadlines get pushed off, and all sorts of problems can arise. And some of those nuances that we were talking about earlier now become something that you may not have thought you had control over, but you do. So it can really put things into perspective. And yeah, you're right. It's the less glamorous side of things, of course, but at the same time, if you want to get to the more glamorous side, let's say, or whatever those goals or visions of success are, those things help kind of, guide you and get you there. So I love that. Hey, since we were discussing a little bit on teams, why don't we talk a little bit about kind of the challenges that, we face? And we kind of outlined a couple there, but, in general, I'd say building teams, in any industry, but especially for, indie games, can be challenging because, let's face it, there's so many other factors. And I think one could be like, and still, this is a very important one, but like a lot of us, focus on and drive with passion, right? And it's important to have, but at the same time, you can't lead 100% with just the passion. So, but there's other aspects too, like there could be like low pay and obviously some forms of crunch and culture, all these things. So I'm curious, like, how have you navigated these similar types of challenges in your own experience? Because, it can be pretty difficult to kind of figure out or meander through these things.
Well, I have managed to navigate it, and I haven't, because I experienced all of the above. So I've experienced crunch, I experienced burnout because of, passion-driven development. I experienced low pay because my initial background was QA, which is the bread and butter of low pay. But what I can say is that I am wiser for it, and now that I experienced it firsthand, I try to educate teams. Well, first of all, as a producer, I really strongly believe that you can create a game without crunch. You can do it. It's super difficult, especially when you take into account what I said before, so the changing environment and the chaos and the uncertainty, but you can do it. So when crunch happens, it's not the failure of the team, it's the failure of the management or whatever form of leadership that there is in a company or a project or a team. So I think as a producer, I feel that I have a responsibility to draw attention to those issues, but most of all, educate teams about the pitfalls of passion-driven development and working yourself to death, because it's very easy to fall into this. Like I experienced this in the past where I had team members that crunched, like would spend the entire night working on something, even though nobody asked them to do it, but they just wanted to finish it. And I don't know, they felt that it's important. They felt that there's a deadline. And they just crunched through the night without telling anybody because, it was voluntary. And it's a trap, because in the end, your team's well-being is a consumable resource, and happy teams make good stuff, and burnt out, overworked, and tired teams don't make good stuff. So I feel, especially in production, it's our responsibility to make sure that the team stays healthy, and also tell people that, look, if you keep doing this, you're going to burn out. And burnout is not something that goes away easily. You can burn yourself out so badly that it's going to take years for you to get back into that groove of making things. So just be careful and, respect yourself, respect your body, respect your well-being, respect your family life, So at least that's my approach. Every day I'm there with my flag saying, no, please don't tell me that, a company has crunch. We don't have crunch control, but it's voluntarily, so it's okay. It's like, no, you have crunch culture. You just don't even accept responsibility for it. You allow your team members to crunch because, they're passionate, and you don't even take responsibility for it. So it's even worse. Please don't do it. Those people are going to suffer in the end.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because sometimes we're like, hey, this is not our philosophy. We don't make people crunch, but if you allow it to still happen, it's almost as being as responsible. It's like there's either crunch or there isn't. So regardless of where your position is on the crunch side, it's still happening, right? So it's like it sounds like it's a little bit more black and white. Now there might be occasions where everybody kind of needs to rally to do one thing, but that's probably more of I would say a one-off situation as opposed to a constant one. And
yeah, exactly. There's a difference between a sprint and
yes,
a culture of crunch.
Yeah.
Which happens unfortunately in this industry.
Yeah,
a lot.
Exactly. So, well, in light of that, and some of the other things you talked about too, I mean, I'm just curious, then what's the solution? What are some strategies or approaches that I would say that you would recommend for anyone listening today looking to build and maintain effective teams, especially considering all the nuances and unique demands, and even some of the restraints that they have.
Okay. I have a lot here, so please interrupt me because I'll keep talking.
Okay. Well, a lot's good. Let's go.
Okay. So I think no matter how small you are, no matter how small a company, a project, a team you are, build your work culture early. So start thinking and talking about it early. What are your values? What are your expectations? How do you make decisions? Because that's important. If there's a team and there's a team lead, then the team needs to know how the decision, like the chain of decision is made. Is it a consensus kind of thing? Is there one person that signs off on things? It might seem trivial, but it's important to know when you're in a structure, in a team, it's important to know where to go to get the decision that you need. So define your standards, even small things. What are your core hours? How do you maintain visibility on who is on holiday each day? Because if you're a remote studio, it might be more challenging, because you never know if the person is working late today or has the person taken a day off, and you need to talk to the person and they're not there and you don't know what's going on. So I set up structure to meetings. So talk to each other saying, look, we're a fully remote studio, but let's use our cameras because communication is easier when you can see each other. We understand if you I get it if someone doesn't want to use a camera that day because it has they have a worse day, but by principle, let's agree that we're using cameras and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. The other thing I think it is important is diversifying teams. So there is a temptation in having a team that has a very unified kind of voice and worldview, but the more different experiences, different approaches, different temperaments, different anything you have on your team, the broader the worldview you have. Like there was this article IGN did a while ago about Life is Strange True Colors. It was not a great article because it was about all the bad things that happened during the development of the game. But one of the examples they gave really struck with me because the writing team was talking about a very specific part of the game where the main character, a woman, was drugged by a friend and brought somewhere against her will. And there was like a whole discussion about it that from the women on the team were very concerned about this part of writing because from their perspective, this looked very much like being roofied, which was completely like the perspective from the writer who wrote it was completely different. So it really illustrates that having a team with different approaches, different worldviews is very important because there's just nuance in everything you do. And you want that nuance in your team as well. What else? I think an important part of any creative process is demystifying failure. Failure happens. And especially in situations where there's a lot of pressure and deadlines, people are often very reluctant to admit failure, and it's bad for the project because failure is just part of growth. Failure is something we do when we try new things or where we experiment or when we just do something out of our comfort zone. So I always like to think that if you're not failing or if I'm not failing, then I'm just playing it safe, and playing it safe is not something I want to do because nothing ever good comes out of playing safe. So just having this understanding that failure is a normal and acceptable thing that happens in a project, as long as we learn from that failure, of course, because if we may make the same mistakes over and over again and don't learn from them, then that's a symptom of a different issue. But just accepting that failure happens helps. Helps people because they're more willing to experiment. Another one is write stuff down. Writing stuff down is great because our brains are imperfect and we just don't remember everything. So having a culture of making notes, having a culture of having some sort of documentation is very, very important because things happen. People get sick, people quit, people forget. We come back to something 6 months later and nobody remembers what we talked about on that current meeting. So just building a habit of making notes. Ideally, have a producer to make notes. If you don't have a producer, just have a culture of making notes. Hire juniors if you can. I know it's difficult if you have a small team, if you have a small budget, but I think it's important to hire juniors because our industry currently doesn't really hire enough junior members and we don't pass them knowledge on. Given the whole layoffs and the atmosphere, I understand why hiring juniors now is difficult, but we need juniors because juniors will eventually become mids and seniors and train other juniors. And this industry needs to keep growing. And it's a very important step of this. We need to pass on the knowledge. Check in on your team members if you can. Sometimes there isn't enough time, then make time, because again, team well-being is very important. So talk to people about other things than the task they're doing. Ask them how working in the project is for them. Ask them about challenges. Ask them about what is frustrating to them, or just ask them, anything about the new game they're playing or the figure. Just make a habit of talking to people, because it's very important. It's very important to kind of have this mental check-in if everything's okay. And if you just rely on normal kind of production or whatever development meetings, you're not going to catch that someone is not doing well. And I guess the last one is have a QA in your team if you can, because QAs are absolutely fantastic when it comes to information about your game. They're always, you can always ask them questions about what they think is wrong with your game, and they will always be a wealth of knowledge. And I don't care what the internet says, QA are developers. Whoever says otherwise is wrong. QA are developers. And if you can afford a QA, an embedded QA, hire one. It's worth it.
Wow, there's just so much there to kind of unpack a little bit. But I mean, let's just call out a few things. I mean, let's take it from the top, right? Culture. Ultimately what that's doing is really just setting expectations for your team. And I love how you called out even the small stuff, like, because let's face it, if we get, we're focused naturally on ourselves, right? Because, well, it's my life. We're taking care of myself. So we might be a little bit more focused on what goes on in my head opposed to everywhere else. So if you're trying to organize and structure a team, and I'm not saying to be micromanaged or anything, but in a way where so you can be mindful of their health, and if their health is good, then that means productivity and goals and everything else can be met. That's important. So clearly setting those expectations, I think, super important, and it just makes for a better environment, better relationships, better, just more fun doing, making games. The other one too, I thought was really interesting when you talk about diverse teams. And I think there's a lot of ways to dive into that further. But what you're saying is, with those diverse teams, you're also having like different perspectives. And with these different perspectives, it could probably equate to a lot more like different ideas with like solutions or how to be effective and all these other factors that we generally may not necessarily think about. Sometimes we think diversification might mean it's not as in sync as we would like it to be. But I think the reality is there's just so much more opportunity there than not. So another great tip.
And different experiences are always
exactly.
valuable.
Yep. And I mean, on that note too, I mean, when you talk about hired juniors, I couldn't agree more about that, because one, when you're getting into seniors and things, and maybe in certain cases they're needed, but there's costs associated with that. And what does that cost mean in terms of the overall production? How do other factors play? But also, like, the thing with juniors is I would feel that they would have a lot more drive at that point. They're fresh. Maybe they might, they're eager to learn. And through empowering them, I mean, they could become pretty strong forces in time to the team and to the industry, like you called out to as well before. Kind of a quick analogy here, but like, I know for a while, and they probably still do, Netflix, in terms of their content, they weren't always just going out to get top A-list actors. Why? Because big costs. It could reduce the amount of content that they're producing, but there's still great quality talent out there that is relatively unknown. And then, wow, instead of like I'm throwing things out here, but instead of like 10 films, now we can produce 50 for the same amount of price. Like, and what does that do for their bottom line in terms of what their goal and objective is? that's way more in line than simply going for the best of the best. And
Yeah.
another way to look at it, but I think that's important to call.
Yeah. Also, another aspect of that is what you said is that, if you have a good culture and a good team, then a junior is going to stay in that team.
Yeah.
He's going to grow, he's going to learn, and that's always valuable. Someone who went through all the steps and all the positions and was years in the company before he himself or she herself became a senior.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the other important thing of everything you shared is just these all basically compound into creating, an impactful and effective teams and doing essentially accomplishing more. So that could mean reduced timelines. That could mean, hey, we could take on multiple projects or whatever. I mean, there's any number of ways that can go be using these things and applying them in different situations. And then the failure part, like, come on, like we dread failure, but if you position it differently, like you mentioned, or let's say, look at it as a learning experience, not as, oh my gosh, I did something wrong or whatever. And again, if it continues to happen, then it involves another discussion or trying to understand the problem, why it keeps happening, right? So, but still, it comes back to that. And then last but not least, I mean, and it goes back to what you shared about, how you've considered, how have you obtained success over all this time as far as what you define it was like checking with the team members and all these things just compound into what we're here to talk about today is like, effective, working with effective teams, making sure that they're effective. And I mean, again, it just affects the bottom line. So much great stuff there. And I'm, it was so hard to distill, but again, it's like, there's just a lot of great stuff there that we probably should be a little bit more mindful and spend the time to do so. So, well,
no, I'm glad you think so.
Yeah. Well, such great stuff, but let's now get into, because one area you were talking to about, you mentioned, we talked a little bit about it, was communication. So I want to dive in a little bit more in terms of what makes like effective communication and also as it relates collaboration, because sometimes when we're sharing ideas, some people's might be, raised or showcased a little bit more than others, and that could be its own challenge in itself. So when we're talking about effective communication, obviously we know that it's crucial, especially in highly collaborative, environments. So I'm just curious, like, could you share some either insights into, how you prioritize and facilitate communication among your team members or just team members in general, particularly in the, let's say, fast-paced, world of development, because sometimes it can be hard to facilitate those things when there's so many moving parts.
True, very true. I think having communication is tricky because everybody thinks they know how to communicate, and I'm guilty of that too. I think I'm a great communicator, and sometimes it turns out but not so much. So I think a lot of like the way you create effective collaboration or good collaboration is just building a very strong framework for communication and teaching people how to communicate effectively. So things like focusing on objectives or objective facts rather than emotions, because especially in creative endeavors, there's a lot of emotions, and sometimes the fact that something annoys me isn't really something that I can work with. If I can say what specific parts of the thing annoy me, or I don't know, I don't like this feature because I feel it doesn't give me enough rewards, is much more valuable feedback than just saying, I hate this feature because it sucks. Great, it sucks, but why? Why does it suck? There's a lot of, part of it is, of course, cognitive biases. So you can be predefined to dislike something because of your experience. Maybe you don't like a certain genre, or you don't like a certain gameplay feature, or you don't like something. And sometimes even being aware of the fact that it's a bias can help in communication, because then you can say, like, honestly, look, I don't like Dark Souls, so everything that reminds me of Dark Souls I'm predestined to dislike it. And that's fair enough. Honesty is the best policy. I appreciate it. Actionable feedback is another thing. It's kind of connected, but all feedback is good, but not all feedback is actionable. So having specific things that I can actually work with. So again, telling me that a specific asset is ugly isn't really very informative, but focusing why do you think the specific asset is ugly is much more helpful. Grounding discussions with examples is another thing. Examples, I love examples. So if you dislike something or a certain situation is, I don't know, frustrating to you, just use examples, because that way we're focusing on specific things, and also it helps person kind of remember what actually happened. Whereas otherwise they might focus on emotions, and memory is also a thing that's very tricky. Specifics, again, I hate it is much worse than I hate this very specific aspect of it. I hate the color, I hate the shape, I don't know, I hate that I keep dying. It's much more useful than just saying I hate it. One of the things that I often do is I ask people that talk to me to relay the information back to me. So if I tell them something, I ask them to repeat the information back to me, because it's a way of checking if how they understood it and if there's no miscommunication in the process. Another thing is understanding that different people react to different information differently. Some people are objective focused, some people don't like fluff, other people don't like technical talk, other people need to focus on high-level discussions, but not specifics. It's also important to relay the information the right way. And the last thing is keeping meetings on track. Everybody hates meetings, but meetings are important. So having an agenda, coming up with specific goals that you want to achieve on the meeting, making sure people stay on track, not overcrowding meetings, because too many people in a meeting is recipes for disasters. Not making meetings too long. A meeting that is longer than an hour is basically, it's not going to work. It can work, but most of the time it won't work.
Yeah. These are so great. And I mean, honestly, everything you just called out to goes back to that main principle of, if you really understand your team, make the time to do so, you can find the most effective ways to communicate with each other. And it also goes back to what we were discussing about the culture. If these things are set up where people understand and know what is effective feedback, what is effective discussions, and things along that, like again, it might sound a little bit too granular, but if you set these expectations and people know what to do, then you're not dealing so much with problems that can potentially become subjective or emotional and all these other things. And you have the understanding of how to deal with certain situations or information received based off of, the characteristics of the team. Some people are objective basis. Some people might be a little bit more emotional in how they communicate this information.
And that's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
You just need to be aware of it.
Yeah, but if exactly. Because if you're aware of it, then you can understand the problem. You can understand the situation, whatever it may be, and then address it accordingly. And the one thing I want to call out, I thought this is just so well. I need to get better at capturing these types of clips. But this one here was, all feedback is good, just not all feedback is actionable. So the question I'm going to pose rhetorically here is just, what kind of things can you do to ensure that within your culture, within how your teams are structured, everyone listening today, how is it structured so it's actually actionable? Because if it's not, hey, great, it's good information, but now it becomes a problem where it's like, well, what do I do with this? Where do I put it?
Yeah.
This is awesome, but I don't know now what to do. And there's nothing worse than having great insight and then being stuck with it.
Yes, exactly.
So many good things there. Now, in In terms of this, and we'll kind of go a little off topic here because this is something that's important to me. And you mentioned, pre-interview, that is kind of something you felt the same way about. And this is simply this, like you and I, and I'm sure a lot of other people out there understand the importance of communication and how it's a super key component to running any business and project. But yet, we don't necessarily find, or at least in my experience, I haven't, too many conversations going on about this from a mainstream perspective. So I'd assume then that might, at least from my perspective, it kind of seems like it might be a little bit undervalued, maybe a lot bit. I think it varies depending on who you're talking to. But from your idea, from your perspective, why do you think that this is the case or appears to be the case? And like, what are some examples from your own experience where you saw that communication itself just, and again, holistically here, but like made a significant difference that I guess could be used as proof that might be able to change this discourse that we see in terms of a mainstream perspective?
Right. I don't want to pretend that talking to each other is the silver bullet, and it's the magical solution to all of our problems, because it isn't. But there is like a lot of problems that escalate could have been avoided if communication was better at a team, company, or whatever. I have this example where I had in one of my previous jobs, I had two people that had very different opinions on a certain subject. They were working together on a certain thing, but they had very different opinions on it. And eventually those opinions became volatile to the point that they disagreed so strongly that it devolved so much that they eventually became toxic, because two people perceived that the other person wasn't understanding them, so they got annoyed and more annoyed and angry, eventually toxic. And by the time that I was started to be aware of the situation, it exploded so badly that they actually needed an external party to come in and kind of mitigate the conflict, which in the end, which is tragic, I think, is that they were basically talking about the same thing. They just didn't realize it. They were actually agreeing on the thing they were disagreeing on. They were just talking so differently about it that the other person perceived it as, non-agreement, which I think was tragic, because in the end, the situation escalated so badly that we had to let go of one of the people because he got so angry that he just was unable to work with the other person in the team, and they were both essential. So in the end, we tried to solve the problem. We tried to mitigate. We tried conflict resolution. Eventually, it just didn't work out. And I think it was tragic because it could have been avoided. And it's also on me, because I kind of noticed that something was going badly, but I didn't react. It wasn't my team. I was buried in something else. It's kind of failure of it's my failure as well, because I could have stepped in. I could have caught it earlier. And the issue probably wouldn't escalate so badly. We wouldn't have to let go of one of the people working on the project. And I mean, I think that's indicative of a lot of things that's happening in industry. There's a lot of toxicity in the industry, and again, I don't think talking to each other is going to solve all the issues. I think solid, honest, respectful communication could have avoided a lot of the conflicts that happen. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I mean, I would say it absolutely does. And I'm hoping that this is more so of in an extreme case that meaning like maybe not, hopefully more of an outlier, or it doesn't happen that often.
Yeah, absolutely.
But still, I mean, I think it paints a pretty clear picture in terms of not necessarily how things or where things can go, but let's say anything maybe not quite that extreme. How does that it's like this nefarious thing that could start slowly setting you off course. And we all know, folks, it could take, if you are going from point A to point B in a straight line, and if you're off course by 1 degree, you are going to be significantly further away from your destination. And what Eva was just talking about, even though an extreme case, in let's say even more minor or multiple minor cases, they can compound to setting that course off 1 or several degrees. So, and again, you're right. There's not going to be one conversation or even many conversations that's going to be the silver bullet. But I think what it really comes down to is having this understanding of how this can affect, how this can impact, at least in a negative way. But it goes both ways, because if the negative side, we understand a lot could be at stake, whether it's the business itself, whether it's individuals, lots of things can happen. Could even affect players too, right? There's lots of ways the end result can affect multiple different types of people, entities, things like that. But then on the plus side, it can go in the other direction too. It could be a positive where, again, just I guess the complete opposite from a positive perspective, that these types of changes and things, and again, everything that we talked about are ways that this can be addressed and avoided. And you know what? I want to call out on something that you said too that I think is very important. When you were sharing that instance that of that particular scenario, you even called out to yourself in terms of recognizing that, yeah, I failed in that time too, because though I was busy doing my job and everything else, I did see something. I feel to a degree I was accountable. And I think a lot of people have a hard time sometimes reflecting or looking in those moments and being like, am I responsible? And it, I don't know, in a very different way, I feel that way too sometimes, where like, I'm a dad, I have 3 kids, but if I see some other kid that's not mine doing something that they really shouldn't be doing, I get it's not my kid. I don't have a right to tell them what to do, but in some way, shape, or form, especially if someone could get hurt or other factors, I'm going to make it my obligation to do that thing. But sometimes we might just look at it like, well, it's not my problem, not my kid. I'm just going to go off. But, but and those little things too can compound into not just doing what's right, but doing something with I guess the right intent, which maybe is the same thing, but I don't know. But there's lots of ways to look at it. And again, there can be pros and there can be cons associated with these things. And while there's no silver bullet, having these conversations on a more regular conversation can at least make things a little bit easier to comprehend, understand, or at least have ideas and potential solutions to these problems that all of us are facing in some way, shape, or form, especially within the industry. So love that take and that story, because, hey, this is all things that can happen, whether they're big deals or not, they can all change our course. Well, we're definitely coming on time here. Unfortunately, because I know there's so much more we could probably discuss, but in light of what we have talked about up to this point, Eva, are there any, suggestions, tips, advice that you could share with our listeners today based off of what we discussed?
I'll do my best. I think the fundamental building block of a good team is trust and respect. And so that's my tip. That we should trust our teams, be open and honest with them, talk often to them, don't micromanage them, and let them fail. Because if the team knows that the working environment is healthy, then the team is going to be much more productive. And that's actually my second tip. Healthy teams make great games. So we should make sure that the team is healthy. Overworked teams experience burnouts, and burnout people don't make great stuff. They can try, but still, well-being is very important, and taking care of people is very important because people make games, and without the people, you don't have the games.
Yeah, simply put.
And the last one is just write stuff down. Please write stuff down, because writing stuff down is great, especially if it's a year later and you suddenly need to remember what was the what you agreed upon on that meeting, and it's a lifesaver. So making a habit of writing stuff down is gonna save you many, many times.
And I can attest to that. And sometimes I feel like maybe I should write down where I put my car keys, because that becomes a problem too sometimes. But maybe that's a little bit too much, but but otherwise, wholeheartedly
Whatever
agree.
helps, you know?
Yeah, whatever helps. At any rate, well, Eva, I can't appreciate you enough for sharing those tips. Really great stuff there. And, you know, if people want to reach out to you, want to connect, want to find more about, you know, Mechanistry and, you know, in Timberborn, what are some links? Could you share anything with us that people can find out more information or possibly connect with you?
I'm not much of a social media person, unfortunately, so I don't have Twitter or anything like that. So if you want to reach out to me, my recommendation would be LinkedIn. Of course, check out Timberborn because it's a fantastic game, and I think you're going to love it. We also, if you decide to pick up Timberborn and you do end up loving it, and I'm very almost, well, okay, I won't say that because that's just tempting fate, but I'm very, very confident that you might like it. Then we also have a merch store. You can check it out on Mechanistry.com. There's a link to our merch store. Yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Awesome. No, that's fine. That's plenty there. So folks, again, LinkedIn, Mechanistry to get out more insight about the game, the company, and also their merch store if you're interested. And of course, Timberborn, it's on Steam. Looks like it's still in early access. Great game.
Yes.
And yeah, well, Ewa, can't thank you enough for being here today and just sharing all this valuable insight. And hopefully all of us after listening today can have more discussions about this, because it's definitely needed. So thank you for everything you provided today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to me.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.